wanted to see what was different across the sound, because people in the North Sound think differently than the South Sound versus West Sound versus Central Puget Sound. And the more people you do, the more certainty you have about the results. So if you do 500, you end up only talking about 30 or 40 in these areas, versus 2,000, you start getting bigger numbers, and you feel a little more confident that you're actually seeing trends versus a few people think something. And that's why you have the margin of error at 2%, and usually about 5. We asked them, this is kind of typical polling, what's bothering you, kind of what are those issues top of mind for you, and you ask them that, and they tell you, extremely, very serious, somewhat serious, not serious. If you recall in July, that's when we were at $4 gas, and not surprising, that was just off the charts. And then you kind of go through what I think everyone would say kind of predictable responses. Climate change is pretty high, actually. That shows you kind of the tipping point that they're getting to. And then we wanted to, in the litany of what's on your mind, we asked this question about, how do we characterize, how we talk about what's going on in Puget Sound, and what's the most effective way? Some people like to talk about the salmon just declining, some people talk about the orcas. What's the most effective message? And so we asked them, polluted stormwater runoff that flows into our rivers, creeks, and sound. And this is uneducated, they just got on the phone, and if you take extremely serious and somewhat serious, you're at 77% right out of the gate. That bothers them. That statement is of concern. And then you keep going down, and you keep out, and you ask them about income taxes, and you keep going through. And then you say, then we ask them, what about water pollution? The number drops. Doesn't have as much resonance for them. Doesn't get it. And then you go on, and then you say, well, gee, what about this polluted stormwater runoff? Look at the number, 35. So just how you talk about the problem changes dramatically the reaction you get. And so we'll get into kind of conclusions, but obviously, our takeaway was the more descriptive you are, the more reactive people are. So if you can talk about rivers, creeks, streams, and not just say pollution, stormwater, runoff, or Puget Sound, if you can bring in the bays, the lakes, the rivers, the things that people really, the vast majority of people do not live on the shores of Puget Sound, so their connection to it is very remote, other than a nice view on an occasional drive. So what they really know is their rivers, creeks, and the streams, kind of their watershed features, is what that tells us they really identify. And then we ask them, typically in a poll, you ask them a question at the front end before you spend 20 minutes educating them about the problem, and then you ask them again, and you say, well, did they move at all? So this is kind of uneducated, and this is where you get that number. This one says 21%. We asked them in two ways. How do you rate the health and conditions of waters in and around Puget Sound? And then we asked them this, and we said, well, does it make a difference if you kind of add some more kind of descriptor, at least in terms of how you describe Puget Sound? Because one of the things we discovered in our research is people have a fuzzy connection to Puget Sound. They kind of, it's a body of water, it's also their region. It's not in other areas. If you just said San Francisco Bay, they know exactly what you're talking about. San Francisco Bay. Versus here, if you say, I live in Puget Sound, some people call it Puget Sound, some people say, I live in the North Sound. There's not a kind of, 4 million people have a lot of different ideas about what Puget Sound means to them. So we were kind of just playing around with, well, does it matter how you talk about Puget Sound? No. If you use kind of the waters, and we were trying to be inclusive and not just say the salt water, and say, waters in and around, that means the rivers, the creeks, everything is draining in. And we're trying to come up with a statement. If we use that, if people get what you're talking about, because if you're trying to do a communications program, if they right out of the gate have no idea what you're talking about, you're kind of already in a hole. So you've got to be really clear about what you're trying to get them to. And really, it doesn't really matter. If you talk about waters in and around Puget Sound, or if you add all the features, not a lot of difference. It's still low. So that doesn't change much. And then you say, well, is this important? Is this urgency? What's the urgency? This is a bit of, it's a bit good news and bad news. The full sample, not surprisingly, we have 21% who think we've got really bad Puget Sound, and 22% think this is really urgent. So that connects. And then you have this, I call this kind of this middle ground, this big mass of people who are kind of on the fence. They're not quite sure, And then you have kind of I would call the 16% is almost, it's almost too far gone. Where do you want to spend your energy? Is it the 42%, that middle ground, the people that are kind of, they get the issue, they're not quite sure, they think it's important. And the other takeaway is there's not a lot of change across the region. It's generally uniform across the region. The numbers don't swing very much from areas. And then we asked, we're trying to probe, how do they understand what's causing the problem? Because sometimes you can have an issue where the people might think this is what's driving it, but the reality is that's not it. This was actually on the good news side of the ledger. Most people, and I was actually surprised, really get the kind of land-water connection that what we're doing on the land is impacting the sound. And so we don't have to spend, that tells us we don't need to spend a lot of time convincing them that, gee, homeowner, what you're doing is an issue. They kind of get that. And so this is where if you combine the both, you get up to 81%. So I think that's a positive, because that's a big hurdle. If everyone thought the only reason that Puget Sound's in trouble is because of what's going on in the saltwater, then we're going to have serious problems on the implementation of the action agenda when you're trying to convince them stormwater retrofit, all these tough issues around growth, management, density. So I think there's been some success in that realm of connecting the dots on land and its impacts on the Puget Sound. And then we wanted to kind of get into, well, who do you think is driving the problem? I think this is, again, a good news. Clearly the message has gotten out, and it's probably largely for the results of your efforts, that business is responsible at the end of the day. A fair amount of people say it's us. That we are the biggest driver of what's going on up there. So I view that as a positive. And then we tested a lot of different issues around what's driving the problem. It's not surprising oil spills is always, every poll I've seen is always number one, because that's the most dramatic, that's the thing people see, it makes sense. And then it kind of tails off from there. What our pollster will tell you is this big brand here, this big line, is people aren't real clear. There's not, usually you see, like, if everyone knows what's going on, everyone gets it. And so you have a big middle ground again of people who are fuzzy about what's driving the problem. They kind of know something's going on. They know these issues are all contributing, but they're not assigning the blame to one exclusively or a few. They're kind of peanut buttering the problem across all the problems, which in reality is really what's going on out there. It's a multitude of sources. And then we kept testing different, who's responsible. Again, you see the middle, this left thing doesn't change. It just tells you people are kind of not quite sure what's going on. And then this is the kind of the money question, which is, okay, we asked this question at the beginning, how do you think Puget Sound is health-wise? And then you spend 20 minutes giving them the parade of horribles. Did we move? And the good news, this is a mixed bag, good news, bad news. I tend to see it as, people who look at this would say, gee, well, before education, you were at 41, you're at 32. But what our pollster did was he went and looked at all those results and said, well, you moved 10% of the people. And then he dug in and said, well, who moved? And what was clear is what I would call our base, our people that generally environmental, they want to do the right things, consider themselves somewhat environmental. They don't know the problem. But once you deposit the problem in a way, they move. And so where we're starting in our campaign is, how do we at least get the folks that are kind of in line with this issue on the bus? And then you step back and say, then there's those people that are more challenging to reach. And so what he would tell you is this is a significant, it's a good movement. In a quick poll, you can get a pretty good shift of people changing their thought about what's going on out there. So it's not overwhelming. You would think after 20 minutes, people would all be saying, this is the end, we need to run out and do this. But it does tell you that they will move. And the movement is greatest in kind of that base of people. Like, it's generally what I call kind of the Oprah crowd. Women 30 to 55 move quickly. Democrats, not surprising, move quickly. White males, not so quickly. And so what we were trying to figure out is who's our base? How do we get our base of people behind this issue on the bus right away? How do we do this in a way that's going to kind of move the numbers quickly? Because time's important. Then we asked them. This is where kind of we never asked them. Never really tested urgency, and urgency is typically tested by, are you willing to